Modern cars are better in almost every measurable way. They're safer, quieter, faster, more comfortable, more advanced. And yet, there are people still driving the same car they bought 20, sometimes 30 years ago. Not occasionally. Daily, they still know exactly how the steering wheel feels, exactly how the engine sounds on a cold morning, exactly how hard the driver's side door needs to be closed. And while everyone around them keeps upgrading, they keep driving the same car. Others sold theirs years ago and still think about it more than the cars they own now, which creates a strange question. What did first cars give people that modern cars can't anymore? Because whatever it was, some people never stopped looking for it. You remember your first car differently from almost everything else in life. The color, the smell, the sound the engine made starting in winter, the tiny flaws nobody else would notice. And what's strange is, people remember those details decades later with more clarity than most ordinary memories from that period. This isn't random. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio spent decades studying how emotion shapes memory formation. His research found that emotionally significant experiences get stored differently by the brain, more completely, more permanently, more vividly. Your first car wasn't just transportation. It was emotionally significant in a way almost nothing before it had been, and your brain treated it accordingly, filed it permanently somewhere deep, in a place ordinary life rarely reaches. To understand why, you have to understand what life looked like before that car arrived. Before the first car, most of your life still depended on somebody else. Your schedule, your movement, where you went, when you came home. Even small freedoms often required permission first. Then suddenly, there was a key in your hand. And for the first time in your life, you could leave whenever you wanted. That feeling changes people more deeply than they realize. Psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan spent decades developing what became known as self-determination theory. Their research identified autonomy as one of the most important psychological needs human beings carry, not just preference. The need to feel capable of directing your own life. And for many people, the first car was the first real experience of that feeling. Not theoretical freedom, real freedom. You could drive at midnight, take the long route home, sit quietly after an argument, drive nowhere simply because being alone with your thoughts suddenly felt important. The car didn't just move people physically, it expanded the emotional size of their world. And maybe that's why people still remember them so vividly decades later. What's interesting is that first cars were rarely impressive. Most were old, cheap, rusty, the air conditioning barely worked. One speaker sounded worse than the others. Sometimes the engine needed patience before starting properly, and somehow, people loved them anyway. Maybe even because of those imperfections, because first cars were usually earned. Maybe it was bought cheap with saved money. Maybe it came through a small loan somebody worked hard to pay off quickly. Maybe it was repaired slowly, piece by piece, over years. Either way, it felt earned. Researchers studying behavioral psychology consistently found that humans attach deeper emotional value to things connected to effort, sacrifice, and personal growth, especially during periods where identity is still forming. And your first car usually arrived during exactly that chapter of life, the chapter where you were slowly becoming yourself. That's why people become emotional about them later. Not because the car itself was extraordinary, because the person driving it still felt full of possibility, and eventually, the car stopped feeling like transportation. It became the background of life itself. First relationships happened there, first heartbreaks, late-night drives with friends, music playing too loudly through weak speakers, driving around with no destination because simply being outside felt exciting enough already. For many people, their first car was also the first private space they ever truly had, a place where nobody interrupted them, nobody judged them, nobody expected anything from them for a little while. Especially for men, cars often became emotional spaces disguised as practical ones, a place to think quietly, to calm down, to drive aimlessly after difficult days. And most men never explained any of this out loud. They just kept driving. Researchers studying autobiographical memory found that emotionally significant environments become strongly tied to identity and long-term memory recall. That's why one old song can instantly bring somebody back to driving their first car at 19 years old, not metaphorically, almost physically. Memory attaches itself to environments more deeply than people realize, and few environments carried more emotional intensity than a first car. What makes this even more interesting is that people who still own their first car and people who sold it years ago often feel exactly the same thing about it later. The people who still drive theirs usually know every detail instinctively. Exactly where the seat feels comfortable, exactly how the clutch responds, exactly when the engine needs a little patience during winter mornings. The car stopped feeling like a machine years ago. Now it feels familiar, reliable, almost personal. But the people who sold theirs discovered something strange too. The memory stayed anyway. They bought newer cars, better cars, safer cars, cars with touchscreens and heated seats and backup cameras. And still, they somehow think about the first one more. Not because it was the best car, because of who they were while driving it. That's the part modern cars can't recreate. Your first car existed during a period where life still felt wide open. First job, first independence, first apartment, first relationship, first real experience of becoming an adult. The car became emotionally connected to all of it, which means most people don't actually miss the vehicle itself. They miss the version of themselves who existed inside it. That's why modern luxury cars rarely create the same emotional attachment, because by the time people buy them, life already feels more structured, more predictable. The emotional intensity of becoming someone is mostly over. Modern cars can provide comfort, technology, status, but they cannot recreate discovering freedom for the first time. And modern life changed something else too. Older cars demanded participation. You listened to the engine, paid attention to strange sounds, learned maintenance, adjusted to imperfections. Sometimes the car fought back a little, and weirdly, that created attachment. Psychologist Robert White documented what he called competence motivation, the deep satisfaction human beings feel when they master something real with their own attention and effort. Your first car gave people that feeling. You learned it, understood it, took care of it, and over time, the relationship felt earned. Modern cars are smoother now, quieter, more automated, everything optimized. And objectively, that's better engineering. But psychologically, something became less personal too. Older cars had quirks, personality, tiny flaws people adapted to over years. The relationship felt human. That's one reason older generations still speak about their first car almost like an old friend, because in many ways it grew older alongside them. And maybe that's also why these memories feel heavier now. Modern culture became increasingly disposable. Phones replaced every 2 years, subscriptions replacing ownership, constant upgrading, everything temporary. But first cars came from a slower emotional world, a world where people expected things to last, where scratches weren't reasons to replace something, where fixing things felt normal, and where objects stayed around long enough to become emotionally important. That's what many people actually miss. Not just old cars. Emotional permanence, the feeling that something stayed with you long enough to become part of your life story. That's why people still remember meaningless details about their first car decades later. The smell after rain, the tiny dent near the bumper, the way headlights reflected on empty roads at night, the cheap fabric seats, the exact feeling of driving home alone for the first time, with no destination and nowhere you needed to be. None of those details felt important then. But memory has a strange way of protecting ordinary moments once time passes. And eventually, people realize something difficult about adulthood. You rarely know which moments are becoming important while they're happening. At the time, it was just an old car. Later, it becomes a symbol for an entire version of yourself that no longer exists. And maybe that's the one thing your first car gave you that modern cars can't. Not speed, not technology, not luxury. A feeling. The feeling that your life finally belonged to you, that you could earn something real, take care of it, understand it, go somewhere without asking anyone's permission. No amount of engineering can recreate that emotional timing. That's why people still talk about their first car decades later, with softness in their voice modern cars rarely receive. Because deep down, they're not really talking about the car anymore. They're talking about youth, possibility, freedom, and the strange, beautiful feeling of life finally beginning. Before you go, what was your first car? And do you still think about it sometimes? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.